The Treasurer leaves for Washington this afternoon. He's deliberately going a few weeks before the budget so that his decisions are shaped by the most up-to-date economic information. Jim Chalmers will hold a series of meetings with key players in the global economy, including the head of the Fed, Jerome Powell, leaders of the World Bank, IMF, as well as finance ministers from India, Canada, South Korea and the Chancellor from the UK. The Treasurer spoke a short time ago about what he hopes to learn from his visit.
It's an opportunity to take the temperature of the deteriorating global economy, to properly understand what it means for us as the government puts the finishing touches on the budget.
For a closer look at some of the lessons the Treasurer might learn and how they could shape the budget, I spoke a short time ago to Professor Stephen Hamilton from George Washington University in Washington, DC. I began by asking him how important it is to get this face-to-face time for Jim Chalmers with some of the world's most influential economic figures.
It's important for us to be communicating with the Americans, the British, the Europeans, the sort of Asian trading partners at a time where kind of international, global economic forces are pretty uncertain, right? So I think the sense is that the global economy is going to slow down, but we just don't have a good sense about how much, when, how bad it could get, right? So it's quite good that at this time the meeting is happening and that Australian officials will be able to meet their foreign counterparts and get a kind of read about what's happening on the ground.
Now, the Treasurer says his budget has this backdrop that you touched on, this looming expected downturn. What sort of range are we talking about here? I know it's hard to predict these sorts of things, but this would be the third significant downturn potentially in a bit over a decade.
Yeah, it's important. People need to be careful when they're thinking forward about what the next 18 months is going to be like. Words of a recession aren't really helpful, right? They're a binary concept, but in reality, there's all sorts of possibilities. So, the global financial crisis was very, very bad in 2008. Australia kind of emerged unscathed for a couple of reasons. And obviously the pandemic just a couple of years ago was very bad. And Australia didn't emerge unscathed because we had to shut our economy down. Now, what we have now is kind of growing pains, right? It's that everything in the global economy slowed down and then we tried to start it back up again. And when you do that, things don't just bounce back costlessly to where we were before. So that process of normalization doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't happen without significant inflation. We went too fast and the world's central banks had to pull back on the brakes because that was generating inflation. And you mix into that this sort of Ukraine crisis and what it's doing to global energy markets, and you get a time for the global economy where the growth just has to be slower than it was. Now that doesn't mean we're going to have a big collapse. It's not like there's a bubble that needs to burst. It's nothing like the global financial crisis. It's nothing like the pandemic. It's simply that the speed limit on the global economy is a lot lower than we expected. And so we have to be willing, at least for the next, say, 18 to 24 months, for growth to be a lot slower than we thought. Now, in certain places, that process is going to be tougher than others, right? So Europe is having a hell of a time, mainly because they're really badly exposed to the energy shock. And the US has had really strong inflation. And so, the pulling on the brakes there is so much more damaging. Australia looks to be, relative to those, a lot less vulnerable to a kind of a sharp downturn.
One of those issues you spoke about, the energy shock, we saw, and the Alinta chief executive yesterday warned of 35% increases in power bills next year. Does that come as a surprise to you, that level of increase or expected increase from that one executive?
So not at all. I mean, we know that gas and coal prices have been through the roof, right? And those prices take a while to flow through to households, right? They don't just happen straight away. A lot of these energy supplies are bought on long-term contracts that don't see those prices flow through immediately. So the fact that it's a pretty significant increase and that it's going to go on for a couple of years it should not be surprising to anybody, especially the government. But the thing to keep in mind then is because we have these kind of rigidities, that applies to energy. It also applies to the labour market, right? We haven't seen a big spike in wage costs because we have these fixed contracts with employment bargaining, but those pressures might flow through slower than they have in other places. And what that means is that the wave, the inflationary episode, it won't be sort of short and sharp like it is in the US. It may be lower but longer than in other places, which means we should expect kind of interest rates to be higher for longer, and we should expect a period of this kind of handbrake on activity to be a lot longer, and it might take us a little longer to kind of normalize back on the other side than some of these other countries.
On the rates issue, we're seeing the RBA divert a little from the Fed with the slowing of the pace of increase in the most recent board meeting. Is that a risky move in your view?
Yeah, look, nobody has a crystal ball. Phil Lowe doesn't, Jerome Powell doesn't, right? None of these people know what the future holds, right? And no economist can forecast the future. We do a worse job than weather forecasters do. The question, I think, for the RBA is, what is their strategy, and basis are they deciding that strategy, right? And I think that's the issue. It's not so much what they're doing. They have some belief, presumably, that the inflation isn't going to be as bad as they expected, or that they've so far done enough to generate that lower inflation level. The trouble I have is that it's a big divergence from what they've been doing in recent months. It's a big divergence from what central banks overseas are doing. But if you read the monetary statement that came out last week, it's not at all clear why they did it. Right? It's not at all clear what they expect the path of interest rates to be. It's not at all clear how they believe what they've done so far will translate into inflation outcomes. They just haven't communicated their strategy to the public. And so I look at it and everyone is left thinking, who knows what the RBA is doing? I guess they think they've done enough. So what we really need, certainly to calm markets at a time of kind of great volatility, is clearer, more straightforward communication from the central bank. It's something they've been criticised for in the past, and I don't see them getting any better.
Professor Stephen Hamilton from George Washington University joining me from Washington. Thank you as always.
Yes.